And then the other piece that I mentioned is like falling in love with yourself. A lot of women that I've spoken to, and I'll put myself in this category as well, we learn about our worth through giving to others, through doing things for others, and we don't actually sit in our own bodies and say, what do you need? What brings you joy? What brings you pleasure? And so I think finding ways to fall in love with yourself, finding ways to honor your strengths.
So how do women gain control of their hormones? What does that even look like?
Oh, well, this is a great question. I think it's multifaceted, as we were talking a little bit about in the pre-chat. I think there's a couple of ways that we can think about this. When you're aging, right? So if you are, which we all hopefully have the privilege.
Everyone's
Yeah,
aging.
we're all aging, right? We have the privilege of doing so. For women in particular, we must consider the changing hormonal landscape that happens over the arc of a woman's life. So there's 35 or 40 years or so where she's in her fertile years, where she can, she's regularly releasing an egg and can become pregnant. And there's a certain cadence to that hormonal release. And then as she's moving into perimenopause, a lot of those sex hormones and there are other things that begin to wane, right? So we start to see things like progesterone decreasing, estrogen decreasing, and that can give rise to a lot of these crazy hormonal, what feels like a hormonal sort of roller coaster. I'm feeling up and I'm feeling down and I'm feeling great and I'm not feeling so great. So in terms of how we might think about this, irrespective of age, but particularly for women who are 30s, 40s, 50s, where they're starting to feel like their hormones are kind of getting ahead of them, there's a couple of ways that we might sort of lifestyle factors that we can think about in terms of pulling some levers that are going to make the biggest bang for our buck. If you think about a pyramid, and if you were to build a health pyramid, let's say, for me, the base of the pyramid is going to be made up of your nutrition choices, which should change as they age. And then the other thing is going to be your movement patterns. And my hope and I'll state my bias for all of you that are listening is resistance training should be the primary form of work for women who are 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond as a means to preserve muscle tissue. In terms of gaining control of our hormones through a nutritional lens, we want to be thinking about, first, it's really important to understand whole foods whenever possible, like some general ground rules, like whole foods whenever possible, understanding that most of the food that we eat is processed, right? So if you're buying chicken breast or something or some meat from the grocery store, it's been processed to some extent. Like you're not twisting the chicken's neck and you're not draining the blood and you're not defeathering the chicken, right?
Many people losing their appetite for chicken
So
at the moment for twisting
I have
the chicken.
relatives in Europe that have farms, and I've literally seen them sort of like twist the neck and everything. So sorry, but that's somehow some places of the world that's how it happens. So there's some processing that happens, but we're not really concerned about that. Processing, of course, happens on a continuum. It's the ultra processed foods that we want to try and avoid as much as possible. Usually the combination of carbohydrates and fats together, something like a French fry, right? It's like a carbohydrate that's fried in fat, a donut, right? It's like dough that's fried in fat. It's usually that combination of those that what we call bliss point foods, where you're combining the carbohydrates and the fat together that are, in and of itself, I would say we don't want to be consuming them all the time. But I have donuts here and there, but I would say that it's the propensity to overeat, overconsume them, right? So it's that caloric excess that happens. So we're having whole foods generally. We're trying to avoid the ultra processed foods. But in particular, it's we want to be thinking about consuming enough protein. And this is really the macronutrient that changes as we age. As we age, just as a natural function of aging, if we're not being strategic, we start to become more insulin resistant. We can lose muscle tissue. And so one of the ways that we can overcome that is by overcoming that insulin resistance, particularly in the muscle, what we call anabolic resistance, is by consuming more protein. So that applies whether you are vegetarian and you like to eat sort of plant-based proteins, and it also applies if you're more of an animal-based or you consume animal products like the chickens and the beef and so forth. So from a nutrition perspective, we want to be thinking about consuming protein, an adequate amount of protein. Good target to start is about 1 gram of protein per ideal pound of body weight. So if you're somebody who wants to weigh, let's say 140 pounds, 140 grams would be your target protein for the day. And then the other thing I would say, in the same way that, not all fats are considered, that they're not all the same, not all carbs are the same, not all proteins are the same. We want to, in terms of our carbohydrate consumption, we want to be thinking about mainly fruits and vegetables. And I know that there's a lot of people in the online space that are like, kale is going to kill you, and it's going to cause crystals in your kidney, calcium crystals, etc. It's like we're already not consuming enough vegetables as a society, so that kind of fear mongering is usually hogwash, pardon my.
I'll just say, we're friends. Our friend Dave Asprey
Yeah.
loves to hate on
I
kale.
love Dave.
He
I love
love
Dave,
Dave,
but it's
love
like
Dave, but he
Dave.
goes a little extreme.
Yes, and I love Dave. So no, Dave, love him very well, and I respectfully disagree with his position on kale. Well, so here's the thing: I make a pretty awesome kale chip, right? But the process, that's like a processed food technically, right? So you're bathing the kale in some oil and some salt, and you're baking it. But usually it's Dave's point, and others, it's not just Dave, but there are others who say, like, the oxalates, we have to be scared of the oxalates. It's like, well, most of those oxalates are destroyed through the heating process. So if you're baking something, if you're stir frying something, and he might be referring more to raw kale, in which case he may have a point, right? But in the heating process, if you are somebody who might be sensitive to oxalates, heating is going to destroy like 80 to 90% of them. And maybe if you don't like kale, you can have spinach. That's also very high oxalate content, but you can saute the spinach with some lemon juice, some oil, salt, like everything's better with oil and salt, really. But anyway, so lots of greens, lots of veggies. I really like starchy carbohydrates, like the sweet potatoes. I like white potatoes. I like rice, that kind of thing, as a side. So these are some of the ways, when we're having whole foods, these are some of the ways that we can sort of think about sending our body the right information, because it's not just the calories that we're eating, which of course is important for body composition. Like how many calories you're consuming is going to some degree, dictate the type of body, like how your body looks. But it's also the information that you're sending at the level of the cell, right? So if you're having good proteins, whether that's animal proteins or vegetarian proteins. I love animal proteins. I feel like they're complete proteins, and I just enjoy the taste. So I consume lots of animal products. Same thing with vegetables and carbohydrates. We're always sending information to the body in terms of what to do: ramp up inflammation or ramp it down. And so the more foods that we can consume where, you can sort of see that it's been picked off a blueberry bush, or it's been, planted in soil and someone's pulled up the carrot from underneath the soil, that kind of thing, the better off that we're going to be. From a movement perspective, as I mentioned, women of all ages, but in particular in our 30s and beyond, it becomes very important to start thinking about muscle as a way to mediate our hormones. So I speak about this all the time. I was actually just talking about this at a conference in England. I was just mentioning to you, muscle serves three functions in the body. One is a mobility function, which we all understand, right? Muscles help us move, but it serves a very important metabolic function. So when we're thinking about hormones, your muscles are the primary site for insulin activity, meaning that it is going to be the primary site for every time your muscles are contracting, you are literally forcing the insulin receptor from deep within the cell to express itself at the level of the cell so that insulin can bind to it. And then we can open up glucose channels and drain the glucose from the blood, right? So primary site for insulin activity, glucose utilization, and also lipids, right? Also fat utilization as well. This is another thing for just as a little pearl, clinical pearl for women who are in their 40s. A lot of times they'll say, like, I'm eating the same foods, I'm working out the same way. And all of a sudden my labs are starting to look a little wonky. Like my blood glucose levels are going awry, my fasting insulin levels are going awry, and my triglycerides and my total cholesterol and my LDL-C, all these numbers are starting to go out of whack. Part of that is the loss of skeletal muscle, depending on what area of the country you're in. Skeletal muscle, and it's the loss of that metabolic function that muscle serves. And then the third, if we want to alliterate, we have mobility, metabolic, and then menstrual. But you wanted to say something.
To spend a moment on that, I just want to call this out because you mentioned donuts, and I just at every opportunity to talk about donuts, I'll always take. And, you talk about consuming more protein, doing resistance training, essentially allows you to consume the donut,
Totally. Yes.
minimizing the effect of the donut. So essentially, the more protein you're ingesting to some degree. I don't know if you should start going 2 to 3 grams per pound, but you're hitting your gram per pound of desired body weight, and you're doing your resistance training. You are less likely to be impacted by having the donut. You can theoretically enjoy more donuts to some extent. We're not going to go overboard by doing those two things.
I couldn't agree more. I love that. And I think that that also allows when you're doing the protein and the resistance training, to your point, it allows for more flexibility because you yourself are more metabolically flexible. And another little pro tip, right after a workout, whether it's a resistance training workout or you've just run, 5 miles or something, you are the most insulin sensitive in that moment. So if we want to be strategic about dosing our carbohydrates, it's right after you work out. If you were going to have the donut, that's the time to do it because your muscles are very hungry, right? So they're going to be taking up a lot of that glucose that they're finding in the bloodstream to sort of bring that up to help, that in that reparative process for the muscles. So, yes, absolutely training allows for a little bit more flexibility in terms of consuming the foods that you love. And I mean, isn't that really the point in of life? Like we can be so healthy and we can like all have all the kale and have all the meat products and all the stuff. But if you never allow yourself to have the donut, I mean, I don't know.
I'm a big fan of the concept of being rigid about flexibility. And so I want to spend a moment on the macros because if protein's the cornerstone, how do you think about macros, protein, fat, fiber, carbs to like build that base that affords us the opportunity to enjoy the donut, enjoy life, like those building blocks, like just on like spend a moment on macros and how you think about that.
Yeah, sure. I think first I'll say I think it's a bit age dependent. My first book, The Betty Body, talked about it was addressing more of the cycling woman, so a woman who's in her fertile years, and how those macros might change should she want to sort of match her nutrition and her training to her menstrual cycle. It was really an intervention to help create that metabolic flexibility. But when we're thinking about macros, one of the things I like to, as you mentioned, protein being the cornerstone, one of the things that I like to talk about is pulling often when we talk about macros, we say, "Oh, it should be this percentage, that percentage." Protein should be 40% and carbs should be 40% and fat should be, I guess it would be 20% if you're doing it in that way. One of the things I like to do with protein is I actually like to pull it out of the percentage and make it a gram target first. That's the first thing that you do, irrespective of the calories that you're taking in. So, we mentioned 140, if your goal is to be 140 pounds, let's say, your target protein is let's make it 150 because I can't do math super. I can't. Let's make it a little easier on myself. So let's say,
We could say 100.
yeah, 100. Yeah. Okay. So 100 grams, that's your target, protein gram for the day. We know that protein has 4 cals per gram. So you're going to multiply that number by 4. So now you know that if you're taking in 100 grams of protein, you're taking in 400 calories of protein per day. So you would take that 400 and subtract it from whatever your calories are, and that's going to depend on your age, your metabolic, how active you are during the day. Like there's lots of calculators online, and I can send you one if you want for the show notes that I like to send people to. It's free; you don't have to enter in your email or anything like that. But it'll sort of calculate and estimate a base metabolic rate for you, which is just the basic amount of calories that you burn just staying alive. And so for most women, it's going to be somewhere around 1,800 to 2,200. We usually split the difference and say 2,000 calories for a female. So if you have now 400 of those calories coming from protein, you would take 2,000 minus 400, and now you have 1,600 calories to play with. So if you're somebody who likes more carbohydrates, you can certainly think about, how many of those calories do you want being dedicated to carbohydrates, or if you're someone who likes high fat, high protein, you can sort of back out the protein and then play with however much you want. So that's sort of how I think about macros is like we do the protein as a gram target. It's not a percentage. And then we back in whatever the person's preferences are. Because there's a lot of people that I talk to that really like high fat, high protein. They really thrive on that. Carbs makes them feel inflamed for whatever reason. They don't do well on it, etc. And then I also speak to women and men, frankly, who find the opposite, that they really like to have they like to match a higher carb and a higher protein intake, and then they like to sort of have a medium to low fat consumption. So depending on sort of your palate and your preference, you can play with your total calories and back in the macros to it. And that way, I know you'll probably have some other questions, but my whole point here is that you're now structuring a diet that you can follow long term, which is when we're thinking about prognosis and the percentage of like the likelihood that you're going to be successful is eating foods that you enjoy eating. Like if I said to you, you got to do low carb and you got to do it forever, and you love your donuts and you love, your carbohydrates, it's going to be very difficult for you to do that long term. You can probably punch it out short term, but the long term adherence is going to be poor because you're going to run up to social events and birthdays and bar mitzvahs, all the sort of social things in our lives where you're going to want to have even like culturally, some foods from grandma's making, the food that you grew up with, and you want to be able to enjoy that. So that's how I like to think about macros. It's like, what's going to serve you long term? Let's pull the protein out first, figure out how many calories that is relative to your BMR, and then back in how you like to eat, high carb, high fat, etc.
It's amazing because it gives you a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point, is like a diet shouldn't feel like you're dying. It should feel like it's just part of how you eat. And and you can sort of dial it up or dial it down. You want to build muscle, you'll do a slight surplus. You want to, drop fat, you'll do a slight, deficit, that kind of thing.
But just to provide a little context, the example you used, 100 pounds, equals 100 grams of protein, 400 calories, 2,000 calorie diet. That's 20% of your calories are protein. That gives you a lot. It's another 80% there. Go to town.
Yeah, you would be surprised how many women actually, even 100 grams of protein, it's very difficult for.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
difficult for a lot of women to reach that. So I usually start, I would probably argue 100 grams is maybe a little low, at least for someone my height, my age, my activity. But we can definitely start there and then see how you're performing, in the gym, looking at once we sort of have your nutrition figured out, we're going to see how that plays with your movement. Like, are you someone who's an endurance runner? Are you someone who's lifting weights? Are you new to the resistance training game? So we can look at your strength and your performance, and of course your measurements over time as well, to see how those things are changing. And generally we want, when someone is starting a resistance training program, we generally want, and these are like the newbie gains, but we generally want in that first 8 to 16 weeks of training for there to be massive gains in her strength, because you are turning over the muscle cells at a much higher rate than you otherwise might, right? So someone like myself who's been training for many years, I can't make the same gains that someone who's new to the resistance training world might, because my muscles have already turned over. So they turn over at a much slower rate now.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of mindbodygreen and the host of the mindbodygreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. So before, and I'm gonna go to resistance training, but I want to close the loop on something you mentioned. I know you wrote an entire book on this, but how do macros change by decade for women? Could you briefly kind of summarize like how we should be thinking about that?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say for a really in-depth, kind of, what I like to call geeky magic carpet ride, you can certainly go and pick up my book, The Betty Body. But for a woman in her fertile years, so 20s and 30s, We want to be thinking, at least for this is based on the thousands of women that I've spoken to. We feel different over the course of the month, right? Over the course of the menstrual cycle, we feel more coordinated, more clumsy, depending on where you are. You feel more energized, less energized, more moody, less moody. So typically, there's two phases of the menstrual cycle. We have the follicular, which is the first 2 weeks, and the luteal, which is the second 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks are generally times where you can push it, right? So they're generally times where if you are someone who really enjoys fasting, if you're someone who really enjoys carbohydrate restriction or any kind of restriction at all, like caloric restriction, carb restriction, you're restricting your fat, that kind of thing, you're more resilient typically to those stressors, those hormetic stressors in that phase. In the second half, less so. So in that luteal phase, if anyone is going to feel inflamed, that's usually the time, the PMS, the water retention, the moodiness, that kind of thing. It's usually the time when women are going to experience that. So I usually pull back on uh, these hormetic stressors like the fasting, the caloric restriction, that kind of thing. And then, we can even break it down even further week by week. But usually, what I like is if someone is metabolically unhealthy, like they've gained weight in places that they don't want, if they're dealing with a hormonal issue, like a lot of women that I've cared for have dealt with something called PCOS, which if you are, it's very common. It's the most common hormonal derangement that we'll see in women, polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's usually rooted in insulin resistance. So for them, pulling back on their carbohydrates actually works really well for them, right? Because we are reducing the carbohydrates that they're consuming. We're improving their insulin sensitivity. We're improving SBG, sex hormone binding globulin, et cetera, which is then going to help with their testosteronization, which is one of the hallmarks of PCOS. So I would say, back to your original question, over the years, it's going to depend on if she's dealing with any kind of hormonal issue. So I just mentioned PCOS, but endometriosis and adenomyosis is another big one. Hashimoto's thyroiditis, another big one that a lot of women deal with. So those kind of different peculiarities or different hormonal situations are going to have a sort of a slightly different outcome. But if you're someone who's not dealing with that and you're trying to optimize how you feel on your cycle, a lot of women feel like in the first half of the cycle, they can really push the fasting, the caloric restriction, the macro restriction, second half, not so much. When we get into perimenopause, and myself, I'm 46 years old. So I've also sort of noticed that my, how should I say it, tolerance to, to fasting has decreased somewhat. I don't enjoy it as much as I used to. And so I don't like as much fasting for a woman who probably, grew up in the same era that I did, which is like we were all cardio bunnies and we were all taught that, being skinny is the way to go,
Cardio bunnies.
right? Like we all like grew up in the cardio section of the gym. And so for her, if she's pushing her breakfast out, like if she's been sleeping, let's say 8, 9 hours, and then she's only eating at 12, then now we're potentially compromising her muscle tissue, right? Because your muscles are catabolic overnight, right? They're releasing amino acids, they're feeding the brain, et cetera. And they only stop being catabolic once you've reached somewhere between 20 and 30 grams of protein, which is why, for a woman in perimenopause and beyond, I would say I'm not such a super fan of fasting any as I once was. That's how things begin to change. Like we're not as, maybe resilient is the right word. We're not as resilient to some of these stressors that come in. So I don't love fasting for a woman in her 40s and 50s for long periods of time. Like everybody fasts, right? But
I want to spend a moment there. Sorry to interrupt, because you mentioned cardio bunnies, and I laughed, but at the same time, this is something I've mentioned previously on the show. We've done such a disservice to women here. I think a decade ago, 5 years ago, or decades ago, I think so much of the message here around managing one's weight was around deprivation. You got to eat, whether it's fasting or cleansing, or, we'll pick on kale, detoxing, or just eating vegetables and not eating enough, or too much cardio. And one, it just science wasn't there, because essentially cardio and deprivation isn't going to do it. But building off of the message of deprivation is just a terrible message. It's one of scarcity. And this idea, and I'm a broken record on this, of actually, no, you can eat. And you're not eating enough. And it's protein you're not eating enough. And yes, you can have the donut. You need to get in the gym and you don't need to lose weight. You need to change your body comp, what that weight looks like. It's empowering. It's and it's more effective.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of the hills I will die on, is like 1,200 calories is not enough for you, girl. It's like that you are just and it's like, where are you gonna go from there? Like, how much further down are you gonna go from 1,200 calories? Like, you're not even meeting your like, you're not even meeting the needs that your body requires. So what does your body do? It steals from it's gonna preserve at some point. It uses up some fat initially, but then your body gets really smart and it starts to hold on to fat like an insurance policy. But where it's going to start stealing from is your muscles and your organs, right? So now your bones are starting to get more frail. You're starting to become sarcopenic. Your brain isn't functioning in the way that it was because all of these things are catabolic.
Well, also too, just to sorry, I'm coming back to the donut because then you put yourself in a position where if you go off I'll say, I don't want to say go off the rails, but let's just say you have the donut, it's going to impact you in such a negative way that it's going to send your lipids probably like your blood work in a negative direction. You're probably going to feel it more, and then you're more likely to restrict yourself, and it's almost this negative spiral. And so the fact it's terrible versus you don't need to lose weight. You need to body recomp, and that puts you in a position of enjoying the thing you want to enjoy versus you need to eat less, do more cardio, and then actually you're going to put yourself in a position that you're never really going to be able to go back to having a treat because it's going to impact you in such a severe way. Like terrible.
That's exactly right. The less that you eat, your body is not stupid. So your body will now slow down your digestion so that it can get every single morsel of whatever food you are putting in. It can extract some nutrients from it. Your basal metabolic rate drops. So when you do have the donut, it's like, oh my gosh, this is, once in a lifetime. We have to hold on to this. We can't use this in any way. Versus if you're having more calories and you're sending that signal of safety, right, to the body. It's like, okay, great. We had a little fat, and we got a little sugar. This is really going to power me up for my next leg day, or it's going to help in the reparative process. If you're having it, like, let's say right after a run or a leg workout or whatever workout, it's going to help to repair the muscles. So I think your point is really well taken. When you are chronically calorically restricting for a long time, the amount of calories that you burn, and it's so unfair because the amount of calories that you burn, even in the same session. So if I did the same leg workout in a caloric surplus versus in a chronic caloric deficit, I'm going to burn less calories in the deficit state because my body is trying to preserve my life. So I think that we want to be thinking a little bit more to your point around being empowered. I would love, love, love this idea of moving from skinny to strong. When you can start in the gym, when you feel really strong, you can lift heavy weights, you can work your way up to, squatting a weight that you're proud of, whatever that number is. I think that is the paradigm shift. And for so many women like myself who are very action oriented, achievement oriented, you can really get hooked on that. Like it becomes this gamification. Like, how many sets can I do? What's my volume? How much can I really push this? And then when you start to see the development of your muscles, I mean, certainly aesthetically, you're going to look great, but also from a health span perspective and a longevity perspective, you're also decreasing your risk of cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, all these like metabolic diseases that seem to catch up with us in perimenopause and menopause as well.
So sorry for the tangent.
No, it's a great one. I love it. It's a great one.
So let's get back there to resistance training. You were kind of I felt like we were going there. Were we? I think we were.
I think we were. Yeah.
Yeah. So how heavy, what frequency, duration, recovery? You made a point of saying if you're early on this is your time to realize quote unquote gains. And it does become more difficult as you become more seasoned, more like I guess your body. How would you just like actually I wanted to get clarity on that. So one, I'll back up. We'll start with How should we start?
How should we start? It's a great question. If it's financially available to you, it would be I would strongly recommend that you don't try and do it yourself. I made a joke about cardio bunnies before. It's like, we're asking all these women who were cardio bunnies now, it's like, now you're going to be a muscle mommy, right? So now you're going to just go leave the elliptical alone and go into the weight section of the gym. And, many women are coming into this resistance training, phase 30s, 40s, 50s. So like your ankle mobility, your hip mobility, your shoulder mobility may not be there. If you are able to, even if you were to just hire a trainer for 1 or 2 sessions to take you through an upper body workout, a lower body workout, give you some comments on your form and things that you need to work on, I would strongly suggest that. I feel like the lift heavy message is a great one, and I think we need to add a little bit of nuance to it, because heavy for me is going to be different than heavy for you, and heavy for me 5 years ago is going to be different for me heavy now. So when we talk about heavy, this is highly individual, and you, the listener who's listening to this, you're going to determine what's heavy. And the way that you determine that is that for whatever set range so let's say you have a set and you're going to do 10 repetitions in that set, let's say. The way that you determine whether or not it's heavy is if you are at the end of that 10 reps, you are 1 to maximally 3. So 1 to 3 reps from failure. Failure means that you are no longer able to do the exercise through a comfortable range of motion that you can own, and you are no longer able to do it without compensatory, biomechanics that are kicking in. So you have to, and this is more of a subjective call than anything. So this is one of the most common questions that I'm asked, is like, what's heavy? How heavy do I have to lift? It's like, you have to be able to determine that. So usually, if you're doing any rep range, anywhere from like 5, the literature is very clear, 5 reps all the way up to 30, you're going to build muscle, right? So if you choose 8, if you choose 15, if you choose 25, if you choose 5, you're going to build a ton of muscle, as long as the little asterisk is you are 1 to 3 repetitions from failure. And failure means you're no longer able to do it in the range of motion that you can own without compensatory biomechanics in there. So it's a long answer. It's like, how heavy? Well, it's 1 to 3 reps from failure in a range of motion that you can own. But that's the nuance that's required to give women the information that they need to get into the gym and be able to evaluate whether or not they're able to lift properly and heavy enough to drive that mechanical stimulus for the muscle to grow.
So you got to push yourself to some degree.
I know that was like a mouthful. I'm sorry.
You have to push yourself, but not to a place of complete exertion, or you're compromising your form in a way that you might end up getting hurt, which is the last thing you want. And this is consistent. I ask everyone this question because I'm always fascinated on different opinions. You really have a lot of room on reps. You got to push yourself. That's the key thing.
Yeah. And like with diet, right? It's like you back out the protein, then you do whatever you want. The same is true in the gym. Anywhere from 5 to 30 reps has demonstrably shown that you are going to grow muscle and strength within that rep range. So you can kind of do what you want. And women who are still cycling will probably notice that there's times of the month where you're like, I am like a beast. So I am going to, I'm going to lift really heavy, but I'm only going to be able to punch out 5, maybe 6, 7 reps. And then there's other times of the month, it's usually weeks 3 and 4, where you're feeling more inflamed, where your motor coordination is not quite there, where your balance is a little off, where always like to kind of joke, like mood swings are your form of cardio, right? So maybe your rep ranges there are a little longer, and so the weight is a little bit lower, but you're doing more reps and you're moving towards muscle failure, albeit at a lighter weight. And I think that that's a little more inviting to women who have been cardio bunnies, that feel a little bit lost in the gym, right? Where they feel a little lost in the weight room because, they're hearing like lift heavy, lift heavy, lift heavy. And it's like, but I don't know how to lift heavy. I don't know even what that feels like. I don't know what muscle failure feels like. It's like, all right, start with a bigger rep range, like do a 20 rep set, do a 25 rep set with lighter weights and get the feeling, because you'll be able to execute that likely with better mechanics, right? You're not going to have usually with a 5 rep set, like there's more of a risk of injury there because it's much heavier. Like you should be a bit more of a seasoned lifter before you kind of attempt that. But you can start off with a 20 rep set and kind of see how that feels. And that's a little less intimidating, but it's achieving the same thing, which is muscle hypertrophy.
Right. And do you buy into, for newer lifters, anything north of, say, 10 sets per body part is going to get you results? And then if you're more seasoned, it's probably going to be closer to 20 sets per body part. And this is on a weekly basis. And then you've got a lot of wiggle room at, like, do I do it all in one day, or do I split it up and do it every other
Oh
day?
God, don't do it on one day. That's a, that's a terrible workout. It's going to take you a long time to work out. Exactly.
But
Uh,
the idea is giving one flexibility of, I have limited time. I can just want to get something in. That's okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, when we look at the scientific literature that's available, it does seem like 10 reps per body part per week is the sweet spot or the minimum effective dose, let's say, for
Sets, you mean? Sets.
pardon me. Yes, sets. Thank you. Yeah. 10 sets per week per body part is what is going to drive muscle hypertrophy. You can do more than that if you are someone who's
What do you do? You're trained. You're seasoned.
yeah, so I right now I'm a little bit in a transition, but typically I work each body part twice a week, and I will have any in each workout I'll have anywhere between call it 5 and 6 different exercises. So it's about that, right? So I will do legs twice a week, and in that leg workout, there's going to be 6 exercises. Usually start off with, well, it depends, but sometimes most of the time I'll start off with compound lifts. Sometimes I like to pre-fatigue. I like to do hamstrings first because hamstrings are kind of a challenge for me. So I'll do the hamstrings first to activate them, and then I'll do my high bar squats. I'll do, whatever I'm doing. But yeah, 5 to 6 exercises per body part. And I'm working, it's like 3 working sets, sometimes 4. So I'm getting,
So what do you mean by compound and working sets? Can you define that for
oh
us?
yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. So a compound exercise is something that's multi-joint. So a squat is a multi-joint exercise. So a squat, you put, whether it's a Smith machine or it's a bar, you are basically putting, some kind of weight, loading it on the back of your shoulders, and then you have the hips, you have the knees, you have the ankles, you have the sacrum. So there's lots of joints that are involved in that one. Movement. So that's a compound lift.
So like a push-up would be compound too, and
Push-ups, pull-ups.
your bigger body part, like your multiple body parts involved versus I'm doing a bicep curl.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. So a pull-up versus a bicep curl. Whereas well, I mean, you could make the argument the long head of the bicep crosses the shoulder joint, so technically it's 2. But okay, so it's like, we're talking about one muscle, right? Like one muscle group versus many. That would be, I typically will start with compound movements, so like big lifts, like the squats, the deadlifts, the lunges, and then I move as I'm getting more tired and more fatigued in the workout to some of the smaller accessory work. So that might be sitting on an like abductor machine, where like you're pushing the pads outwards, so you're working either glute med, depending on your positioning, glute max, and then maybe calves or something like that. But I mentioned I like to pre-fatigue my hamstrings because my hamstrings are very slow, like they're very slow to grow. And if you think about, this is just me being a total nerd. This is me being a total nerd right now. But when you're squatting, because the hamstrings cross multiple joints, when you're squatting, one part of the hamstring is lengthening and one is shortening. So the net is that the hamstring actually doesn't change length in a squat. So you don't actually use the hamstrings as much versus on a seated hamstring leg curl, let's say, or lying hamstring curl. So I typically will try to start off with a curl movement because my hamstrings just don't want to grow. Like they don't grow.
So
So
how did you get there? Because I think everyone, at least my take is everyone has some weak spots and strong spots where there are some muscles where they can do practically nothing and they grow like weeds, and other spots where, they
you
got to
just
work
look at them and they grow.
hard.
Like my quads grow really easily. Yeah, I just think it's you just notice it with time. Like I don't have to do much and you can always sort of see a quad sweep. Like I always have ladder, like my outside of the quad will always sort of be there. And it gets a nice big pump with my lunges and my squats and things. So I think you just learn your body with time. If you're someone who's more data driven, you can certainly be looking at your measurements over time as well, because you'll see changes in your measurements in the for me, my arms, takes a really long time for me to see any changes in my biceps. I really would love to have bigger biceps, but I can curl a lot. They're very strong, but the absolute sort of width of the bicep for me, it's another slow grow area, so I have to work a little harder on that. But you just see that stuff with time. Like a lot of women I find struggle with. They're sort of in the same camp as me that their quads are very dominant. The glutes are also not dominant. So I'll ask a lot of women, like, hey, what do you feel when you squat? And 8.5 to 9 times out of 10, women will say, I feel my quads. I feel the front of my thigh working rather than my butt. So, there's some mechanics in there that we might look at. We might change the way that they're squatting. We might strip off some of the weight and really work on full range of motion, pausing, controlling the eccentric. There's a lot of different tools and techniques that you might employ with a woman to help her sort of feel and get that mind muscle connection to the muscle that she's trying to activate. But a lot of that sort of comes with time and experience.
How long did it take you to get there?
I would say that I'm still a work in progress. I mean, I think I know I'm going to be until like my last breath, but I would say I really started lifting. I was an aerobic instructor for years, and then there's something happened to me in 2007. I was like, you know what? I want to get on stage and I want to compete. I want to do a figure competition. And I want to do this. So I hired a trainer, did all the things. So I've been lifting more seriously since 2007. That was really when I sort of fell in love with what we've been talking about, like working on your strength and working on increasing the muscle size and the power and how great you feel. So I don't know, how many years is that? 2000, where are we now? 24, 16. Yeah, 16 years, 15, 16 years. Yeah.
So in addition to I think, cultural reframing of, it's okay to be strong, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen here in terms of resistance training and women?
I think culturally we are seeing a bit of a shift, right, to that muscle mommy, like wanting to be strong. And I love that name, by the way, which is, I can't remember where I first heard it, but I was like, oh, that's me. I'm totally like fit over 40, muscle mommy. Like I'm all in for that. Um, I would say for me, I can say that the first time that what really rattled or really shook my worldview of perimenopause, and this is going to sound a little silly, but it was watching the Super Bowl halftime show. It was when J Lo and Shakira were on, and they did like their little duel. And at the time, Shakira was like mid 40s. J Lo was like 50, 52. I can't remember exactly her age, but she was in early 50s. And I was like, okay, like I remember watching the Golden Girls and they were in their 50s and they certainly did not look like J Lo and Shakira.
They were in
So
their 50s?
yeah, like Blanche. I don't know if anyone ever watched the Golden Girls. I used to watch it all the time, but Blanche was like 50. She was like 50, right? And I remember right after that show, there was all these memes like what 50 looked like in the 1980s, which is like Blanche and Dorothy and whatever, the characters from the show. And then, then you had like a picture of JLo like on a pole, like doing pole dancing. And so that really shook me to my core, because prior to that, and I don't know what year that was. I have to go and look that up. It wasn't that long ago. It was like maybe 5, 6 years ago. I remember thinking like, okay, just like everyone else, very worried about what perimenopause might look like. And I was like, all right, if she can do it, right? And I know she has a lot of help. She's got chefs and she's got trainers and all that, but she's still's got to put in the work. Like she can hire all the people, but you can't buy a healthy body. You can't, that's the one beautiful thing about muscles. Like you can't buy it, right? You can take supplements, right? You can take the mindbodygreen, creatine and the protein powder, which I love, by the way. You can take those things, but you still got to put the work in at the gym. Like you still got to work. So I remember being like, all right, I know that she's got a lot of help, but I can totally figure this out as well. So that was like a big cultural shift, at least for me. And if anyone ever saw that halftime show, it's like worth looking up. It's
We'll link to it in the show
yeah,
notes.
it's like 5 minutes or however long it was of amazingness. Um, and I'm starting to see a lot of women now, and maybe this might just be the algorithm on Instagram working for me, but I'm starting to see women. There's this woman, I think she's 70 or so, Joan, Body by Joan or something. She's like 70, 72. She's doing pull ups. She's ripped, and she only started like 5, 6 years ago. So that's the other thing too. If you're someone who is thinking about resistance training, it's like the best time to start was 10 years ago, right? Second best time is today because it doesn't matter if you've never done it up until this point. What matters is that you start today because in 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, gosh, 8 weeks, you're going to start seeing some incredible changes in your body composition and of course your metabolism and the way that you function.
100%. And so, talk a little bit more about how you structure your week. How many days resistance training? Do you do cardio at all? Do you do HIIT? How do you structure your week in terms of movement, if you movement as a broader category?
I love weight training, as you may have guessed. So I'm training usually 5 days a week, sometimes six. Sometimes I'll throw in an extra shoulder workout, which is light. Like shoulders are small, like it's not a big ask. So 5 to 6 times a week. I walk a lot, so I will typically go for a morning walk, anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes in the morning. If I remember, I put on my weight. I have a weighted, like a rucking vest. So it's like just like a 20-pound thing that I'll go around with. So that adds a little bit of that, bone density training and adds a little bit more intensity to the walk. I do have a bike that I really like at the house. So if there's if the kids are watching, like right now at the time of this recording, there's like a big soccer tournament going on and they want to watch all the games. So I'll just get on my bike and I'll watch, it's like a zone 1 or zone 2 that I'm watching the game with them. So I'm probably on that maybe twice a week. And it's usually on the days that I have trained like I never do anything on leg day. Leg day is like I don't do anything else other than, working at my computer or, take calls and what have you. But upper body days, I find particularly shoulders in particular are a less energetically taxing day. So I'll throw on something else, later on in the day, whether it's another walk, my kids will bike, or I'm on the stationary bike at home.
How long do you get in the gym for?
Probably in and out most of the time, 60, 75 minutes maximally.
So you go long. You go long. Well, I would consider it long.
I would say leg days are a little longer, but that's because I need more rest. I need more rest time in between the exercises. But 60 to 75 minutes is where I'm most comfortable. I can, if I have to, and I can get things done in 30 minutes. I can, if I don't have a lot of time, like I can punch it out in 30. But I like to, when I'm at the gym, I sort of like to luxuriate there. So I take my rest time and, I'll talk to people that are there and it's a little social activity for me as well.
So I'm more of the I don't have patience or time, like 20 to 30-minute camp, and I don't rest. So I'm a big fan of drop sets.
They're
And
the best.
like I
Yes.
just where essentially you start with a heavy weight and then do your call it 5 reps and then immediately drop the weight, go 7 reps, and drop the weight and at 9 or what have you. But you continuously drop and then boom, 4 or 5 sets, you're done. You move on. No rest.
Yeah, I love that as well. We were just traveling in Europe and just very short on time. I was a speaker and, had commitments and whatnot. And we were doing exactly that. So it was, I guess the technical term is a myo rep. So you basically say, okay, I'm going to do 5 reps and then I'm going to take a 5 to 10 second break. And then I'm going to punch out another 5 reps and then another 5 to 10 second break and then another 5 reps. And that's like set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4, and then you're done. Right. So you can get in and out, to your point, 20 to 30 minutes. It's very intense, very effective. And the nice thing about that is you're actually training the muscle for the most part, like for the majority of the time when it's close to failure, which is actually what you want, right? So the drop setting that you're doing, it's like you're already tired and you're continuing to go. And that's going to also drive a really beautiful signal for muscle hypertrophy as well.
The other thing I love is because you're not resting, and the weight's coming down, by the time you get to the end and you're really struggling, the weight has become significantly lighter. And so you're less likely to get injured.
Correct.
I have found I've run into problems when I am fatigued and I'm trying to go heavy.
Yeah.
That's when injuries occur, in my experience. So if you're fatigued and the weight is much lighter, you're much less likely to get injured. And that's like the last thing you want.
Correct. Yeah, I would say injury prevention, and this is sort of a function of good technique and really understanding, great recovery principles and all of that. But preventing injury, especially as you get older, we just don't recover the way that we used to when we were 20. And not that I mean, you can do some damage in your 20s as well. But when you're 40 or when you're 50 or when you're 60, you're not going to recover at the same rate and you're not going to recover as fully. So I do love what you're saying around this idea of injury prevention because you're right. At a lighter weight, it's much less likely, even though the fatigue is high, you're much less likely to have compensatory mechanics that are going to cause the injury, and you're going to have generally more control over the movement. So I do like that as well. That's great.
So we've covered a lot today. What else would you? I love what you said earlier. I will die on a hill. What else will you die on a hill for when it comes to this broad category of women and hormones and being metabolically healthy and managing their weight and being strong? This broad category of women's health. What are you willing to die on a hill for?
Yeah, so those are hills that I've already talked about some of the hills I'm willing to die on. I would say the other one, maybe a little less sexy, but I think just as important is this idea of, and it's a bit intangible, but I would say stress management and falling in love with yourself. So I think that a lot of women, we've been conditioned, we're natural caregivers, we're always caring for other people, and I think that in many cases, what ends up happening over many decades and many years is that we actually forget to take care of ourselves. We're always giving to other people. And so I think stress management is very important. When we move into our 40s and our 50s, of course, we have aging parents. We have kids. If we've chosen to have kids, those children are now teenagers, which is really, in my opinion, anyway, as a mother of teenagers, this is when the real parenting really begins. So there's sort of this unique sort of stress sandwich that you enter in your 40s, where really becoming a recovery boss and managing your stress, setting boundaries is important. And then the other piece that I mentioned is like falling in love with yourself. A lot of women that I've spoken to, and I'll put myself in this category as well. We learn about our worth through giving to others, through doing things for others, by how many things you've been able to check off on your to-do list. And we don't actually sit in our own bodies and say, what do you need? What brings you joy? What brings you pleasure? So many times I've asked women, like, what brings you joy? And the answer is something like, I know the words that you're using, like I understand the English language and the words, but I don't know how to answer that because we don't even think about ourselves. And so I think finding ways to fall in love with yourself, finding ways to honor your strengths, finding ways to love all of your ugly bits, right? Like the sparkly bits, the shiny bits that everyone loves, but also the gnarly bits, the things that you still need to work on as an individual, just allows you to take more pleasure in your life. We've talked about longevity and health span, and I don't think that there's any justification for living a long, healthy life if you hate who you are. So, like, what's the point? Like, I'm going to live to 90 or 100 or whatever, and I can't stand myself. Like, I think that's a misstep. And I haven't quite figured out how to communicate it, in the same way that I can mechanistically talk about protein and resistance training and myo reps and controlling the night. Like, I haven't figured it out exactly yet, but it is something that I think about deeply because a lot of women, when you get down to it and I've developed enough rapport with them, the conversation is always like, but I don't really like myself, or if I just was like this, then I would feel worthy. And it's like, it's always this thing in the future. It's like, why don't you just love yourself right now? Why don't you just think about 5 things that are amazing and stunning and exquisite about you right now? And if you're listening to this, and if I were to ask that to you, what could you say? A lot of women generally struggle with that question. If I say, "Hey, tell me 5 things you think that are stunning about me," you might be like, "Well, you're this and you're that." And you might be able to say, you might be able to ramble off 5 things. But if I said, "Okay, and now what are some of the things that you find stunning about yourself?" Most women really, really struggle with that. So that's the other hill that I will die on. And I'm still, as I mentioned, still struggling in terms of how to really communicate that with the depth that I think and the importance that I think that it needs. But that's the other piece, is the emotional part, the recovery part, and then maybe most importantly, like falling in love with yourself as a human.
Well, it is a very important piece to say the least. And in closing, where can people find you? Anything exciting you're working on that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so you can find me at drstephaniesestima.com. We have our podcast there. I'm a fellow podcaster, as you are. It's called Better with Dr. Stephanie, where we have thought leaders and scientists and things. We talk about all the things that we've talked about today and more. I have a newsletter that I send out every week. It's called the Mini Pause. It's my little play on menopause, and it's a weekly roundup of action items for women 40 plus. And you can find that on the website as well. So it's drstephaniestima.com/newsletter.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a delight.